Listen!
Welcome everyone, this is Andre's Restart, and this time we are talking about some apparent leaks regarding the graphical power of the Nintendo Switch 2. So I just got back from vacation last night. I'm getting back up to speed on things, so the edit for this video may be a little bit more quick, but there's been some pretty good information coming from a few different places that I think gives us a pretty good understanding of what's going on. Now you may have seen some people talk about some of these things already, but I do think there's definitely some confusion here on what exactly is being suggested, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before going further, let me point out that we are aiming to hit 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year. So if you do enjoy my content, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. With your help, it might just happen. So there's this user known as I'm a Hero 2 on Reset Era, and someone's trying to pose as them, but they put out their information on what they've heard from both Sega and Square. And their track history is revealing correct information on the Persona games, so there does seem to be some validity here. And the timing sort of checks out as well, because recently we saw Gamescom, and going into Gamescom, a lot of us were thinking that a lot of developers would get together, there would be some discussions behind the scenes on what the Nintendo Switch 2 might be, and that we might hear something relatively soon. Well, it looks like that relatively soon is now, at least to some extent. And this is not the only information that has come up recently, by the way, but we're going to be focusing on this, and then I'll be bringing up the other thing that will sort of give us a bit more perspective here. Now, this person said multiple things about Sega and Square, but I'm just going to be focusing on the Switch 2 stuff. So they say, Switch 2 dev kits have been here for a while. I can verify it is backwards compatible with a few games tested, new cartridge, new camera feature. So that's the Sega stuff. The Square stuff we'll get to. But this Sega stuff is pretty great. So first off, dev kits have been out for a while. That bodes really well for the system coming out sometime next year. But also here they're saying it is backwards compatible. They've tested with a few different games. And this is great news as well, because we can still play our games from Switch on Switch 2. There's been some debate on this because some developers supposedly haven't said that there will be, according to some reports, but then others have. And my perspective on that has simply been, well, there are different versions of dev kits. Maybe some have older dev kits, but the newer dev kits are backwards compatible because they're more finalized versions, which is why we'd be seeing some discrepancies. Never mind the fact that it just makes sense for Nintendo to make the Switch 2 backwards compatible. There are so many people playing games on Switch that are active users. Nintendo's talked about how they want to have a smooth transition. Backwards compatibility is a key part to that. Nintendo does have a history of backwards compatibility already, especially with their more successful systems, including their handhelds, and the Switch is a hybrid, it's not just a home console, so I think that also supports the idea of backwards compatibility. Never mind the fact that the mainline Pokemon games are now on Switch, so if you look at how the mainline Pokemon games were handled on all the handhelds, they always had the mainline releases come out on the prior system, even into the new generation every single time for the first couple years. So backwards compatibility is extremely important here, so people can have access to their prior Pokemon games transferring over Pokemon, but also still being able to play the new Pokemon games on the newer systems. That way, Pokemon Company can still get all the sales they want to enjoy because it's consistently every year, but for those that want a better running version to some extent on the newer system, that will still be an option. Point being, backwards compatibility is really likely, and this leak here supports that idea. But they say there will be a new cartridge, which is confusing some people. How could there be a new cartridge, a new form factor, and there still be backwards compatibility? Could there be some limitations here? Potentially, but also it might just mean that they're doing what they've done in the past with their handhelds. The Game Boy Color, there is a difference in shape for those cartridges, and the same can be said for the DS and the 3DS. The way it was done, new cartridges would not fit on the old systems, but old cartridges would fit on the new systems. In other words, there will be exclusive Switch 2 games that you will not be able to play on Switch, but all of your Switch games you will be able to play on Switch 2, or at least most of them. That's the implication here. Now they're also saying there will be a new camera feature. What this camera feature will be, hard to say. Is it going to be on the Switch itself? Is it going to be on the controller so you can still use this new camera feature while docked? I might have to think on this a little bit more before I have some sort of brain blast on what this may mean. It could be augmented reality, it could be Nintendo bringing this in from the 3DS era so they can try it out again in some way, shape, or form. But for now, I'm just going to say that we probably need a little bit more information before we can say for sure what it is, or even have a really good guess. But let's get into the graphical stuff. So regarding the Square information, this is what they said with Switch 2. Final Fantasy VII Remake looks and runs like a PS5 game on Switch 2. Port took no time, I'm told. Could be a launch game, not sure. So firstly, I love the idea of 7 Remake coming to Switch 2. That would be amazing. And perhaps this information bodes well for other games that have been multi-platform games that would work really well on Switch 2, like an Elden Ring, for example, or a Resident Evil 4 Remake. And with a port taking no time, that also bodes well. Now, this honestly doesn't come as too much of a surprise to me because Nintendo has partnered with Nvidia for the Switch, and I imagine they'll be doing something similar with the Switch too. So that architecture is actually really easy to develop for. It's part of the reason why Switch has so many games. But the challenge comes when the games are made for a much more powerful piece of hardware. The spec range is quite a disparity, so the developer needs to take a lot of time to re-optimize the game, change around assets so it can fit and look and play relatively well on Switch. That's where there's a challenge. But if the Switch 2 has that architecture from Nvidia and also that additional power, that way there doesn't have to be that much optimization and changing of assets and scaling down, then yeah, the port jobs are going to be a lot easier. So we could see a lot more quality games that haven't been on Switch that will be on Switch 2. And they even make mention that this could be a launch game, which would be wonderful to see. I'm sure there are going to be some quality third-party games that will be coming out during the launch window where they'll want to take advantage of being available early on the system. But the big thing everyone's pointing to is how it's going to run like a PS5 game, at least on the dev kit. That's how it's looking. What does that mean? Well, first off, this is on the dev kit, and the dev kit may not be the same as the actual Switch itself. That may be clocked down a little bit. Keep in mind that the Switch itself has varying clock speeds and spec ranges, and it never runs at its maximum optimal setting because that's just not conceivable because it's a handheld system. They need to take power consumption into account. They need to take heat into account. So even when it's docked and it can scale up its visual fidelity to some extent because of that power connection, they can't go full power. So no, I don't think that PS5 graphics is what the Switch 2 will be. However, I do think we could be getting to a point with Switch 2 where the graphics will be so good that it will look comparable to some PS5 games. Now, it's worth noting that 7 Remake isn't a built ground up for PS5 game. This was something that we could play on our PS4s, for example, and so they simply had an enhanced version for PS5. Perhaps the real implication here is that Switch 2 games are going to look better than PS4 games by a noticeable margin, and it's going to be sizable enough that the kind of PS5 games that we may get that are made for prior systems but scaled up, Switch 2 games will compare to that. Which I think makes a lot of sense when we consider some new information we've gotten from Nintendo Prime, our friend, who has been covering a lot of this news the last few days, and has spoken to a few different developers that have been sort of pointing him in the direction of this system being around the level of a PS4 Pro. Now, there's definitely room for interpretation there. Does that mean in handheld mode? Does that mean in docked mode? There are still questions in the air. But one thing that seems clear to me is that we shouldn't expect straight up PS5 level power. Yes, the Switch 2 is coming out a few years after PS5, so that does bode well for it getting closer. But at the end of the day, if this is going to be a sequel to the Switch, as some reports have indicated, like from Video Games Chronicle and Eurogamer, where it will still be able to switch, it will still ultimately be a handheld device that can power up a little bit when docked, it's going to be mobile hardware. It can't be as powerful as the PlayStation 5. That box is huge. It's just not a reasonable expectation. But can it get relatively close? Close enough for the mainstream, where games still look good, where games still have a mode for 4K televisions that look and play great? I think so. I think we can get a lot of games like Elden Ring, like Final Fantasy VII Remake, like Resident Evil 4 Remake, that will look and play well on Switch 2. And they won't be like these blurry messes with poor frame rate as we've seen with some third-party ports on Switch. So I think this is fantastic. I think it's exciting. If this is the range we're going to be close to PS4 Pro range, I think that'll be really nice. And I think this bodes well not just for third-party games, but for first-party games, Nintendo games, which is what I know a lot of you care about. What does this mean for our Zeldas, our Metroids, our Pokemons, our Marios, and so on? It means that as amazing as some of these games have looked for the very aged power of the Switch, on Switch 2, it's gonna be leaps and bounds better. Let's keep in mind that the Switch power is still comparable to the power of the Wii U. The Wii U had some bottlenecks, and yes, Nintendo has done a great job of really pushing things on Switch and making them look a lot better than some Wii U games. But it's still relatively comparable. It's kind of like a GameCube to Wii jump, which was not too much. What we're talking about here with Switch 2 is an actual significant next generational leap in power. So the visual leap we're going to see for exclusive Switch 2 games is going to be substantial. And a lot of games that were made for Switch in mind or might be cross-gen, maybe like Metroid Prime 4, are going to look and run quite nicely on the Switch 2. Metroid Prime 4 will blow our minds. If Tears of the Kingdom has DLC with a graphical update, that may blow our minds. The next 3D Mario, oh my gosh. This game, I believe it's an exclusive Switch 2 title, likely a launch title. When we see the next 3D Mario, our minds are going to be blown. That's what I think. Obviously, metaphorically speaking. I think it's going to look amazing, and I am very excited for the future of Nintendo games on this system. Nintendo just seems to have a knack for getting more bang for their buck when it comes to power, because they've been dealing with weaker hardware for some time already. They're very efficient with what they do. They find workarounds, they have great art directions. So couple that with an actual significant leap in power, we're talking about some fantastical things. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. This is Andres Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care.